You reached a point where it no longer made sense to justify what you felt. Not to him, not to anyone, not even to yourself. It was like repeating words in an empty room. They would hit the walls and come back, cold, distorted, unanswered. You had screamed in every possible way, as with your voice, with your gaze, with your weary body trying to smile among the fragments. You explained through long texts, short sentences, rhetorical questions, and desperate pleas that were never seen as requests. But the truth is, you didn't want to explain. You wanted to be seen, felt, welcomed without having to translate what you felt as if it were a foreign language to him. And perhaps that is the most silent pain of all, when you are still physically present, but emotionally you are already drifting away. Yeah, you stopped trying, not because you gave up on love, but because you realized you were losing yourself trying to be understood by someone who only heard what they wanted. You started to silence yourself. First you stopped demanding, then you stopped asking. Next you stopped explaining. And finally, you stopped waiting. That was the true breaking point, when your absence began to fill the space more than your presence. And ironically, that's when he noticed. It's always like this. The other person only listens when your voice has turned into absence, when your soul is no longer there, when the silence becomes a scream perceptible even to those who never truly knew how to listen. You had always been there, with your raw love, with your honest dedication, with your weary hope. He never noticed. He was so used to you explaining everything, what you felt, what hurt, what you needed, what was missing, what wounded you, that he came to think it was your obligation, as if it were your role to make everything understandable for him, as if his not understanding was your fault. But now in the silence, he started to hear what you could never express in words, because there are pains that we only understand when we lose access to them. Some people only learn to listen when they can no longer hear. And there are feelings that only become visible when the explanation runs out, and the absence starts to hurt more than any conflicting presence. You noticed this, maybe unconsciously at first, but it became clear in every small surrender you experienced. The day you stopped texting to explain why you were acting strange, the night you turned to your side and pretended to be asleep. The conversation you didn't continue. The "I'm fine" you said when nothing was fine. The "forget it" that deep down meant "this destroyed me inside." That's when you realized that explaining only made it bleed more, and that those who love don't need you to translate your pain all the time. Those who want to see. Those who want to feel, perceive. Those who want to stay, listen even to the silence. And he only started to notice after you stopped trying. What hurt even more was that now he seemed to finally understand. Suddenly, he began to act differently. He wanted to know how you were. He wanted to ask what he could do. He wanted to turn back time with overdue promises. He began to show attention, care, interest. But you no longer felt the same impact as before. It was no longer a hunger for presence. It was caution. It was cold sadness disguised as everything is under control. Because now you already knew. He understood why you stopped explaining. Not because he finally started to see you spontaneously, but because he lost the manual. And maybe deep down that made you feel even more alone. Have you been through this? Tell me here in the comments, or just write, "I needed to hear this." Silence is not the absence of love. It is the last effort of emotional survival. When you no longer have the strength to justify what you feel, it's because you've already spent everything you had trying to make the other person understand. And that, in itself, should have been enough. But it wasn't. So you fell silent. And silence became your most authentic way of continuing to love yourself, even when no one noticed. He noticed. Yes, finally, he noticed. But not in the way you dreamed. Not with that scene where he gets emotional, takes your hand and says, "Now I understand everything you felt." No. His realization came in a cold coffee, in an absence that didn't just hurt him, but echoed in the environment. On a Sunday when you didn't call, on a birthday you forgot. It came in the emptiness. Because the emptiness you left was the same one you felt for months. Only now he felt it too, and there was no one left to explain. That's how the realization happened, and it was at this point that you understood that. Sometimes stopping the attempt opens up space for the other to feel. Sometimes being strong means not saying anything at all. Sometimes healing begins in silence. And if you've made it this far and breathe, you're not alone, nor wrong, nor excessive. You just grew tired of begging to be felt. And now, finally, you recognize the power in returning to yourself, even in silence. It was in a mundane detail, a simple gesture, almost invisible. But it echoed within him as if it were the first time he truly looked at you. Maybe it was the way you walked past him without meeting his gaze, or how you responded with something automatic, lifeless, tone-deaf, affectionless. It was in that subtlety that he began to notice that your voice was quieter, that your hugs were shorter, that your good morning no longer had light, that you were there but no longer present inside. And then his silence began too, but it wasn't the same silence as yours. It was the silence of someone who started to understand that something precious was being lost. He began to think, but to think differently, not to blame you, but to try to find the moment when everything collapsed, the exact moment when you inside gave up. And for the first time, he no longer had you as a guide. You weren't there to tell him what was happening. You weren't there to explain. You weren't there to calm him down, to translate, to take care of his guilt. It was just him, alone, with his own perceptions. This is how the deepest internal process he's ever experienced began, to perceive what you felt, not because you explained it, but because he felt what it's like to be ignored in silence. He started to remember every time you tried to talk, and he interrupted you with, "We'll talk about that later." Every time you cried in the shower so you wouldn't bother him. Every time you sent a long message, and he replied with an emoji. Every time you tried to be rational so you wouldn't be called dramatic. Every time you begged for his presence, and he labeled it as neediness. He remembered, but not just any memory. It was like an emotional reenactment. He relived within himself what you felt, and he began to understand. That what killed everything wasn't a fight. It wasn't a mistake. It was the invisible accumulation of his small absences. Yes, he started to understand that you didn't want another text. You wanted a gesture, that it wasn't about making up. It was about feeling at peace. That what you explained so many times wasn't to prove something, but because you had tried every way possible and only words were left. And he didn't hear. He didn't want to listen. But now, the silence belonged to him, and the absence was yours. And the pain was a visitor he could no longer send away. It was then that he tried to return. He called you to talk, said he had been thinking about you both, that he was confused but missed you, that he wanted to understand what was happening with you. But when he said that, you just looked at him, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a kind of resigned weariness that only someone who has loved until the end can feel, because you knew. He didn't want to understand you. He wanted to understand the effect of your silence on him. It was about him. It was still about him. And in that moment, something inside you shattered completely. Have you ever experienced this? Comment here. I needed to hear this today. The real awareness of him hadn't set in yet. What he was feeling was discomfort, loss, a lack of control, but truly realizing what you went through. That only came later, much later. It came when he, for the first time, became vulnerable, when he tried to reach out to you and you didn't respond, when he tried to be sweet and you were indifferent, when he sent a "I miss you" and you replied with silence. At that moment, it wasn't just his pride being wounded anymore. It was his heart begging for something it no longer knew how to access. And then he cried, but not that impulsive, desperate sobbing. It was an internal cry, silent, lonely, that no one saw, that he couldn't even explain. It was the cry of someone who began to understand everything they had ignored. The cry of someone who realized it too late. And you? Did you feel that? Did you feel that something in you was also dying? It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't coldness. It was just your emotional self protecting you from more pain. Because you knew, if you explained again, you would lose yourself again. So you chose not to react, not to feed it, not to respond. You didn't want to punish him. You wanted to preserve yourself, and even without saying a word, that you said everything. And it was then, exactly then, that complete awareness hit him. That morning when he woke up, looked at you sleeping on your side, and saw a whole world between you, you there quiet, calm breathing, distant, at peace perhaps, but not with him. And he knew, without needing to hear it. He realized that you tried, that you loved in your own way, that you went beyond what you could, that he had time, had a chance, had love, but he didn't have awareness. And now, there he was, in front of a present body, with a soul that had already departed, He thought of everything he would have done differently. But now all that remained was the echo of your absence. And that's what hurts. The late realization, the wasted love, the ignored explanation, the silence that now screams louder than any word. And you no longer smile for any affection. You don't melt for crumbs. You won't go back to the same point just because someone realized too late. Because now you've realized too. You realize that your silence brought you back to yourself. That love doesn't need to be explained 1,000 times. That if someone doesn't recognize your pain on the first request, they don't deserve more than one. You realize that your worth doesn't depend on someone else's understanding. It depends on your own ability to listen to yourself. Have you realized this too? If so, write here in the comments, "I'm back to myself, and now he suffers." Yes, not because of your malice, but because the process of realization is always painful, especially when it comes too late. But that pain is his. You don't need to save him from it anymore, nor explain, nor justify. You are no longer responsible for emotionally educating anyone. You just need to continue in peace with your silence, because it was your silence that healed the wound that the explanation only made worse. And this healing, it isn't the end, it's just the beginning, because now you're going to discover what it's like to be perceived by someone who feels before you even explain. You didn't quite know when this happened, but you realized that something inside you had changed. Definitely, it wasn't a loud change. There were no fireworks. There was no announcement. It was subtle, like all true transformations are. You just stopped thinking all the time about what was lacking. Stopped analyzing every detail of what he did or didn't do. Stopped wanting to be read, understood, deciphered. You simply stopped. And in that stopping, something began to emerge. You started to taste your own presence. The freedom of no longer needing to translate yourself. The lightness of not carrying the weight of someone who never really listened to you. The peace of not having to beg for love. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, you've started to breathe fully again, without holding your breath waiting for a message, without sleeping with your phone in hand, without mentally revisiting all your conversations to figure out where you messed up. Because now that you knew it wasn't you, it wasn't your intensity, it wasn't your way of loving. It wasn't your tireless attempt to be seen, it was his absence of presence, of touch, of perception. And when you finally stopped explaining your feelings, you became perceptible, not just to him, but to the world, to the people around you, to yourself. What you couldn't see before is now clear. You are perceptible, always have been. But you were trying to explain this to someone who only knew how to hear their own voice. Not anymore. Now your silence has become magnetic. Now your calm unsettles those who could only access you through your pain. Now your absence speaks with a strength that no words ever could. And the most beautiful part is that now you don't speak to be understood. You simply are. You exist with the wholeness of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. And yes, he notices this, more and more, even without saying it. He feels. He feels he's lost something rare. He feels that you don't hate him, but you no longer need him. And that hurts more than any argument, because before you fought. Now you simply observe. Before you explained. Now you quietly withdraw. Before he felt you would always return. Now, he knows you left a long time ago. Have you gone through this? Comment here. Today I realize who I am. You've become a perceptible absence. The kind that doesn't need to be present to be felt. The kind that, even in silence, provokes. The kind that teaches without speaking. You've become what no one wants to lose again, and he knows this. That's why he's now trying to be all those things you explained. But it's too late. Not because you've turned to stone, but why have you now turned inward and discovered the most sacred place? You. Yes, now you recognize yourself, and that's enough. You no longer need to prove that your pain was valid. It was. You don't need to shout to be heard. Your energy speaks. You don't need to beg for care, because now you take care of yourself. You don't need to be understood anymore, because now you are felt. And the most ironic part is that now you are felt even by those who never managed to see you before. Old friends come back and say, "There's something different about you." New people approach you with reverence. The energy shifts. You have become pure presence. And now, what was once seen as drama is recognized as depth. What was once confused with neediness is now admired as sensitivity. What was once ignored is now respected, because now you don't explain, you exist. And that in itself is the loudest scream you've ever made. Do you realize this? If so, comment here. My silence set me free. And him? He continues to feel you. He keeps looking for you in songs, scents, moments. He keeps trying to understand why it took so long to see. He still wants to say he misses you, but now the absence is his. The pain is his. The way back no longer exists, because you have already come too far to fit again in a place where you had to explain who you were. Now, your place is where you are felt before you speak, where you don't have to fall apart to be loved, where silence is home, and not punishment. You understood. Those who truly love see it in the eyes. They perceive it in the tone of voice. They notice it in the fatigue of the body. They even see it when you try to pretend everything is fine. Those who love don't need a subtitle. And if someone only starts to understand you when you stop explaining, that person never understood you. They just reacted to their own loss. Now, you choose where you want to be felt and by whom. If this text resonated with you up to this point, take a deep breath. You're not wrong for feeling too much, you just needed to listen to yourself. And today, you listen to yourself before trying to be heard. You embrace yourself before begging for acceptance. You recognize yourself before asking someone else to see you. This is the true end of the cycle. Not when the other person sees it, but when you realize you no longer need that. This conversation doesn't end here. I'll see you in the next video.